Okay, welcome back. Now we've gone over some stuff here in Mental Ray. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on another aspect of Mental Ray and use some of the new features and tools in Exercise 7 with the latest version of Mental Ray. So, to demonstrate these new features, let's go ahead and let's open up another example scene I have prepared for you here. So, let's open up the scene called ArchViz Start. So we're going from doing this old, very gritty sort of a dungeon scene that's very dirty, very dark, with some very dark and contrasting lighting, going to a more clean architectural visualization type scene for all of you people out there who are trying to work on some clean product visualization or architectural renders. So this will work out real good for you. So here we have a pretty simple scene here. It's basically a small section of a house. Just did this room area here. Didn't do a whole house, but just to demonstrate lighting purposes, this will work out really well. So if we do a render preview here, using all the default settings here, this scene it's just the modeling and texturing here. There's no lighting set up right now. This is the default lighting. You can see I have some cards out here outside the windows to simulate an environment on the outside, because all the renders here are going to be done from the inside of this room. So if I switch over here to say shaded mode, we can see what the inside of the room looks like in here. So it's fairly detailed. We have some seating arrangements here, some miscellaneous things like lamps, light switches, and doors, and a little bit of a nice home entertainment system here with a nice big old plasma TV. And of course we have some windows here with some blinds and some furniture and stuff like that. So it's your pretty standard architectural visualization scene. And if we do a render preview from inside the scene here, this is what we have. Doesn't look too interesting. You can see we have our models and everything set up, but in terms of the render quality of this is obviously unacceptable. And that's because we're using the default lighting that XSI creates for us when we start up a brand new scene. So if I go ahead and open up, say, the Explorer view here, we can see we have a default light. If I go to my ambience, you can see I have the default ambient set up. Okay, so first things first, let's get rid of this stuff because we don't need this default lighting. So I'll take the ambient lighting, knock it down to 0, select this light, and delete it from our scene. So now if I do a render, I should get just a black render here, which you can see is the case. And we can still see these pictures outside the windows, and that's because those pictures are using constant shaders. So they don't take any light shading into account when their lighting is when they're rendered out and calculated by the Mental Ray renderer. If I open up the render tree here on this guy right there, you can see we're just using a constant shader with an HDR image, which happens to be an OpenEXR format. Just creates for a nicer and better looking outside environment than using just a simple JPEG where you won't be able to control the gamma or the exposure very well. Okay? Alright, so let's start to set up the lighting for this. And in this series of videos that we're going to do here with this specific scene in this instance, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on indirect illumination for this very nice clean architectural scene. And in the past, what we would use with Mental Ray is things like photon mapping through global illumination, shooting out photons from our lights, and also using final gather to create a nice indirect illumination effect. In the introduction to Mental Ray tutorial that we released December of last year, we went ahead and we covered final gathering and global illumination and how to use them both together to create some very nice photorealistic clean rendering in another architectural sort of scene that we did before. In this one, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on using not just global illumination and final gathering, but we're also going to use, and we're going to throw into the mix, one of the latest and newest features in Exercise 7's integration of Mental Ray, which is importantons. So we've talked about importantons before this. We went over the basics of importantons, how they work with global illumination and photon mapping, and what their benefits are. We got to see how the photon map was drastically reduced when we used importantons to optimize the global illumination photon map. Okay, so we're going to see how we can use all of that in the next series of videos. So before we can get in that, we have to set up our basic lighting setup, which is actually not going to be too basic. It's not going to be too complex either, but let's see how it's going to be. We're going to have some direct lights in all of these windows, and we're going to use portal lights, which are also new in exercise 7, and you're going to get to see how to use them in the context of using them for an architectural visualization scene. Portal lights can help your architecture scenes look extremely realistic and make the lighting look more natural and more believable to the human eye and to your viewers. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's start to set up our direct lighting. So I can either start by creating my portal lights or creating a mental ray physical sky system. So I'll go ahead and create the sky system first. And this is pretty easy to do. We've already done this before, so I'll just go through it quickly. Over here under the pass, we'll go to the edit button and we'll go ahead and click on initialize sky shader. All these default options are fine, so I'll just hit apply. And XSI goes ahead and creates my skylight here, or my sunlight I should say. Okay. Next thing to do, I'm going to open up the render tree for the sunlight. You can see it has a soft light shader attached to it. Ooh, that's no good. So what we're going to do is go down to the light menu here in the preset manager. We're going to grab ourselves a physical sun shader, drag and drop it to our render tree here. And we're going to take it and we're going to plug this guy into the light shader and the light photon emitter shader ports of our light material here. We don't need this soft light anymore, so we can actually delete it. And here's our mental ray physical sun shader. So let's go ahead, and the first thing I'm going to do, let me close this. I'm going to try and go ahead and set up my light where I want it to be set up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it in the X here, and I'm going to put it at about 37 units in the X. And maybe I'll take it and put it at about 46 units in the Y. And I'll put it at maybe negative 0.5 in the Z. So it's sort of right above here. It's going to be maybe about a 1 o'clock in the afternoon sort of sunlight there. So it's pretty strong. It's almost right overhead, right over the sky. And it's going to be coming in at a pretty good angle right into our room here. Okay? Alright. So I have these camera recording icons for this scene. You can see I have 4 different positions set up for this camera. The position I want to go in is the second position, which is right about in here in this hallway area right there, just past the big screen TV. And I'll do a render preview. And you can see in my render previews, they're going pretty fast, but they are going to start to slow down a lot as I start to introduce more and more lights into the scene, which is exactly what we're going to do. So what I want to do is make these render previews go by a lot faster. I have to be doing render previews a lot during the working on this little project here. So what I want to be able to do is create my render previews extremely fast. So I'm going to go over here to the render menu, and I'm going to go to render manager. And for the default pass, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on override scene render options. And I'm going to switch over here to custom format. I'm going to change the width here to 400, and so long as I have the lock aspect ratio turned on, which is by default it is turned on, when you change the width, the height is going to change and keep the right aspect ratio of the image. Also, for my mental ray settings over here, I'm going to take my max level anti-aliasing to 0 and take the minimum level to maybe -2 and leave my sampling contrast at 0.2 for the RGB and A channels, or alpha channel there. And close that. And now if I do render previews are going to go by a lot faster because they're smaller and they're rendering at less quality. So it doesn't look that great, but at least we get to see what's going on in our scene. Okay, so here's our sunlight coming through. Right now our sunlight is a little bit blown up out of proportion. It's coming in too bright and looks too white here, which I don't like. I want it to look a little more saturated with color, make it look a little bit nicer. So let me just go over here to my Explorer, and I'm just going to dig in here and grab my physical sunlight. And I could also grab it in the viewport, but I'm a little bit too lazy to do that. I'd rather just do it through the Explorer, which to me seems faster. So I'll grab my physical sun shader here, and I'm going to pin that down. I'm going to work with this a little bit here. And I'm going to do a render region so I can see what's going on here. If I go over here to render regions and I go to all options, I have my render region set up to use the current pass options, which is what I want. That way I keep some consistency between the render region and the render preview window, and they don't come out different because that can throw you off. Alright, so over here in the multiplier is actually way too strong. By default the setting is 1, which is actually a pretty bad setting. So I'm going to knock this down to something very low, and this number has to be extremely low. So let's try 0.1. So you can see how my lighting's coming out. Now you can see the texture on the floor is coming out better. And the texture on the floor is a texture of wood. If I come over here to my shading options, I'm going to switch to texture decal so you can see that. And you can see the textures here. The floor is actually supposed to be this nice varnished floorboard texture. And of course with the sunlight blown out so much, you can't see it. But now we can start to see it a little bit better. We can start to see the colors better, even though this is still a little bit blown out. So let's knock this multiplier down even more. You can see how sensitive this setting really is. So I'll knock it down to about 0.05 so I can see this a whole lot better. So now I can see the texture clearly and it looks pretty good. Now, just one thing to make note of here really quick. When you create a physical sun shader, like when we came over here and we initialized the sky shader, by default you notice that the sky shader, or the light that's used for the sunlight here, was using a regular soft light set to an infinite light. Okay? That infinite light is no good for physical sunlight systems. You're supposed to use the physical sun shader here when you're working with those physical sunlight systems, if you're trying to go for a nice, plausible, realistic sunlight lighting there. If not, you can use the infinite light. In this case, I'll use the physical sun since it's much better. Okay, so the rest of these settings here, I can actually change and tweak some of these. For example, the shadow softness. You can see here that on the edge here of this shadow, we have this very nice softness. It's sort of trying to mimic an area light, but it doesn't. It's not a very strong area light effect. It's actually very soft because in real life, even though the sun shoots parallel light rays, you'll still get this nice soft shadowing that looks like an area light, but it's not so strong as your traditional area light. So an infinite light would just give us these hard edge shadows that will look too unrealistic and not very natural at all. So that's why you want to stick with the physical sunlight. Over here in the shadow softness, if I knock this down to 0.5, you notice that the shadow softness is going to go ahead. It's going to get a little bit softer, a little bit nicer here. It looks like a nice hard edge, but if we got really close and increased our anti-aliasing, we would see a very nice soft shadow effect right there, which you can actually make it out pretty good right there. Okay, so I'm going to leave the shadow softness at about 0.5, but I'm going to increase the samples here and double it to 16 so that the shadows are more visible and look nicer. Okay, of course increasing the samples is going to increase my render time, but in this case it didn't increase it too bad, so the render hit isn't too bad, but the quality increase is definitely worth it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that my sunlight is pretty good where it is. Okay, so now that I have my sky system set up, and if I do a render preview from out here, you can see I have my sky in the background there. If I rotate my camera, there it is. And even though I have a sky background, I still elected to use these background cards here, which create a nice atmospheric effect in the background and looks much nicer in my opinion. Okay, so let's continue and let's wrap up setting up our direct lighting rig here, and this is going to be pretty simple and straightforward from here on through. What we're going to do is set up portal lights at every single one of these windows. So you can see we have ourselves 6 windows. We have this big one over here. We have these 2 and these 3 right here where the couches are. Alright, so we're going to need ourselves 6 nice portal lights to create some very nice lighting, direct lighting for our scene. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go up here to primitive, let's go to light, and let's grab ourselves, we'll work with point light instead of a spotlight. I like to work with point lights for portal lights. Okay, so here's my soft light, and if I go ahead and open up its render tree, it's not very nice, just has a simple soft light shader to it, and there's my light. Let's go ahead and get it into position first, and then I'll work on setting up the portal light settings there for it. So let's just move this up, and we're going to put this one, we're going to start off, it doesn't really matter what window we start off with, but I'm just going to go ahead and choose to start off with this window here. So in the Y, let's place it at about 10 units high, something like that. So it's pretty much in the center of this window here. And there's better ways to center this on the window, but I'm just going to choose to do it this way. We could actually just select the light, go to the transform menu, go to match translation, and choose, see this window frame here? Go ahead and choose the window frame, and the light will be placed right at the center there, which should be more or less the right location. But right now the light is actually inside. You can see it's actually inside the window there. So I want to pull it back. And I'm going to pull it back to maybe about in the x-axis. And I'm looking at the MCP over here. I'm going to move it to when it's about 12.5 units, so about 12.5 and change. So right there's actually pretty good. Alright, I'm going to say that I'm happy with that. Okay. Right, the next thing I'm going to do is open up its render tree here, and let's set up the portal light for it. So I'll open up the preset manager, still in the light menu here. I'll grab the portal light shader and drop it right into my render tree. And I'm going to take it and plug it into the light shader and the light photon emitter shader, and we can get rid of the soft light. We won't need it. Okay, let's open up the light PPG here. For the portal light to work, if you remember from previous videos, we need it to be set to an area light, and we need to set the visible in render parameter on, and the geometry has to be set to rectangle. Okay, so that's pretty good. That's pretty much done. Over here in the MIA portal light settings, I have a lot of options to set up. I'm not going to worry about that for the moment though. Let me just pin that down because I will be using this in a moment, and I'll close the render tree. Okay, I'm going to come back here. Maybe I'll pick my second camera view position, and I'm going to go ahead and do a render preview and see what I have. And what I have is not too interesting. I really don't have any lighting coming in from that portal light. So let's increase the multiplier. Let's get it to something really high, like 100 for example. See the render preview here update, and you notice that there's no change. Well, we have a problem here. Let me go ahead and collapse that portal light PPG. And the problem is that our portal light is facing the wrong way, as you can see. So let's go ahead and let's turn it so it's actually facing inside of our room here. And we also have to make the portal light larger, because you can see the portal light is being shown here by this square icon, which is the actual area light. What we need to do is make that bigger, because it's a little bit too small right now. So let's go ahead and let's do that. I'm going to go back to the PPG and go to the area menu here, and what I need to do is take this scaling, and we need to increase the scaling parameters for the X and for the Y. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take the X here and increase it to about 10. That's pretty good. Let's increase it to about 12. And I could make it the same size of the window or get it closer to the size of the window, but in terms of production use, this is actually a lot better. Let me explain why in a moment. Let me go ahead and make this. I'm going to use the light manipulator tool. That's B for Bravo on the keyboard. I'm going to make this fit the window pretty good, so it's going to be really big. Really big. You can see there it's about the size of the window. Okay? Now, one thing about area lights when you're working with mental ray is the larger the area light, the more samples you're going to need to get the area light shadows to look good. The problem is that this is where rendering time is wasted. The more samples you use, the longer your render is going to take. The larger your area light is, the more samples you're going to need, and the longer your render is going to take. So the smaller the area light is, the less samples you need to get a very nice area light shadow. Okay? That's why you want to use the largest area light shape that you can without going overboard. You don't want to go too far. In this case, I don't need my area light to be so big. It doesn't have to be the same size of the window. Okay? I can actually get away with making it smaller. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make it smaller. I'm going to set it to 12 in the X and 5 in the Y. So you can see it's a lot smaller than the actual window here. But it's still big enough where it's going to bring in a lot of nice lighting into the scene through that window. And that's exactly what I want. I want it to bring in as much lighting through that window as possible without going overboard on the render times. So let's go over here to the second camera recording icon there, and let's render again. And now that the portal light is much larger than originally, and the fact that it's also facing inside a room really helps, of course. Now we can see that there's some lighting coming into our scene. So let's increase the amount of lighting because it's a little bit dim and dark right now. So let's double it to 200, and we can see it update, and it's looking much better. Of course, it's looking a little bit too bluish, and also these areas here closer to my window are getting blown out. So that's a problem. If I dim it down, it'll fix this blowout up here on the ceiling, but it's going to mess up the rest of it because the rest of it's going to get very dark. So how can we get around this problem? Well, this is where another neat feature of Exercise 7 comes into play. Let me go ahead and collapse that. I'm going to go over here to the render button, and I'm going to go to the pass options. I'm going to go to pass shaders here. You can see here's my physical sky shader. What I want to do is come down here to lens shaders, go to override camera lens shaders, and I want to add a photographic exposure shader, which is right here, the MIA photographic exposure. You can find it in this location here inside your shaders lens mental images folder. Open up the photographic exposure shader here, and let's adjust some of these parameters. Or let's just go ahead and do a render just to see how it looks. I'll just move the render preview window over here. You can see automatically the colors are adjusted and look much nicer now. This isn't so blown out and that nasty blue like before, and you can see the ceiling's not blown out either. Right now my gamma is set to 1. I want to do some tone mapping here, so I'll increase my gamma to about 1.8. Usually you should set it to 2.2, but just for the sake of making this look nice, I prefer a setting of 1.8. Because if I go to 2.2, you're going to notice that the image is a little bit too washed out, and I don't like that. The good thing about that is that I can see the dark areas better. The bad side is my image gets washed out, and that's no good. So I'm going to stick with 1.8. And I'm not going to worry about the dark areas now anyway, because later on we're going to set up global illumination with importans and photons and final gathering and stuff like that. So the dark areas are going to be visible anyway. So I don't need this gamma to be so high. Okay, you can see photographic exposure suppress some of those oversaturated colors, like the super blue that was popping up over here in this on the left of our image here. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. Another thing I want to do is bring out the colors a little bit more, so I may want to increase the saturation here. So let's take this saturation and let's increase it by a little bit. So from 1 we'll go to 1.25. Just to bring out the colors a little bit more, because the tone mapping is washing out the colors. Okay, there we go. Now that looks much nicer. Now we can see the blue a lot better, but it's not exaggerated, it's not blown out of proportion, it doesn't hurt the scene, it's actually helping it out. So that looks pretty good. In terms of the rest of these settings, I'm going to leave them alone. I'm not going to add any other stuff here because my image already looks pretty good. I like it like this. Okay, so let's close that. Okay, so our lighting here looks pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and double the multiplier here to 400 and have a look and see what this looks like. Oh, that looks really nice. Okay, really does look like the sun is coming in that window, and there's this nice, very nice early afternoon lighting coming into our room. So this looks great. I'm going to leave my light set to 400 for the multiplier or the brightness. And the rest of these settings I'm going to go ahead and leave them alone because these defaults are pretty good. So I'll close that. Okay, so now that I have one window or one portal light for one of these windows set up, it's really easy. All I need to do is duplicate that one and move it over to my other windows. So let's just go ahead and hit Control Alt and D for dog on the keyboard, to bring this light over here. And I can place it about right here. And I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm not going to be too precise about this. You can be more precise if you want to, but just for demonstrations sake, this is going to work out pretty good. Okay, so there's my other portal light for that window, which already has all the settings for it. So that's pretty good. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this same portal light again. And this one's going to be used for this window that's over here. I'll just turn it like this so it's facing inside. Place it about right here. And that's pretty good. Okay. Let's switch here camera position so we're looking at this area here. Let me do a render preview from here and see how this area of the house is looking. This looks pretty good. Of course, our render quality is set so low but at least it gives us a good, nice, fast preview so we can see what in the world is going on here, which is extremely important. And speed is everything, so we want to make sure we can move as fast as possible. Alright? Okay, so we have 3 more lights to set up for these 3 smaller windows over here. So let me take this portal light here. I can just grab it. There it is. I'm going to duplicate that one as well. And I'm going to move it over here and place it here at this window. Now this one's going to be a little bit trickier because this window's at a bit of an angle. So I'll just have to rotate this. And this is going to help if I go into the top view here. And I rotate this based on the top view. Okay, so it's rotating the y-axis about 135 degrees. But I'm going to get it to closer like, say 131 or 130. It's going to work out pretty good. So I'll go with about 132. Looks pretty nice. Okay. In terms of the x-axis, let's leave it at there. It looks like it's pretty much in the center of the window there. That's actually pretty good. Again, it doesn't have to be totally precise. In the z-axis, it's actually looking pretty good as well. And for the y-axis, I think we're good actually. Let me go in here back into the camera view. And yeah, that's actually pretty good. Not bad. Okay, now the other thing is I have to make this area light smaller because you can see the shape doesn't fit with the window. So let me go to its area light parameters, and we're using the 12 and a 5 for the x and y values here, which is obviously no good. So let's switch it to something like 5 and 5. And that's pretty good, but I think I can make it a little bit bigger. Let me go with 6 and 6. So it's a little bit bigger and nicer, and brings in my lighting a little bit nicer into that window. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'll leave the multiplier at 400. I think that's actually pretty good. Okay, so that's not too bad. If I come over here and I do a render preview from here, you can already start to see the lighting coming into that window and hitting parts of our couch here and our wall. Of course, this doesn't look too great, but we're going to make it look real nice. I promise. So let me close this render preview. We don't need it anymore. I got the idea. There's some light in the room. Now I'm going to take that same portal light, just going to duplicate it and move it on over to this window over here. Rotate it like so. I'm going to have to go back into the top view here to make sure that this light is rotated correctly and put into position the right way. Okay, so for the rotation in the Y, I think 50, about 50 degrees looks pretty good. In terms of the translation, let's see here. In the Z-axis, let's move it a little bit closer maybe. Something like that. About 47, 48. So it's just outside the window right there. And in terms of the X-axis, I think about 30, 29 looks pretty good. Yeah, right there. I'll say that's the middle of the window. And that's pretty good. That's pretty good for just eyeballing it into position. I'm going to duplicate that same portal light. Bring it back over here. Go into my top view. Going to rotate it so it's pretty much straight. About 90 degrees. I'll go ahead and type in 90 in the MCP here just to get it a little bit more accurately. Go back into my camera viewport. Try to place it in the center a little bit better. Okay, so in the Z-axis about 35 units looks good. For the X, I'll leave that alone. That's pretty good. Okay, not too bad. So I'll go to my first camera viewport or camera recording here, and I'll do another render preview from here and see what we got. Okay, so that doesn't look too bad. Very nice. I like the way that the lighting's coming in, and since the blinds on the windows here are they're at an angle a bit, it actually affects the way that the light is coming in from outside. So it's actually pretty realistic. Very nice. I like this lighting. Very good. Okay, so there's our portal lights. They're pretty much set up and in position here. The only other thing to take into account for these portal lights is if we go to the area light parameters, the samples here are set pretty low by default at about 3 and 3. All the lights are using those sampling parameters. I could increase them to improve the quality of the area light shadows, But since we're still doing preview renders and we're still in a sort of testing phase right now with this project, we don't want to go ahead and blow out our render times like crazy, because we want our previews, like I said at the beginning of this video, to go really fast as possible. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. I'm going to say that I am happy with this. Let me just do maybe one more render preview, maybe from this angle. I haven't seen this angle with all the lights set up. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Pretty nice, pretty nice. I like the way that this looks. It's looking really good. Okay, now there's one thing that I noticed that I do not like. If I come over here and do render region over this area here, I don't like the way that this shadow is coming here from this window frame. So where's this shadow coming from, and why is it so strong right there? Well, that shadow is actually coming from this light that's over here. If I come over here, this portal light that's in this other window here is actually casting that shadow from here over to that door frame over at the end. So how can we fix that? Well, the simplest way to start to troubleshoot that is if we go ahead and open up the shader here, we can see the multiplier is actually pretty high. So I may want to go ahead and reduce the multiplier or the intensity of that light. Okay, so I'll go ahead and pin that down. I'm going to go back to the door frame, or I'm sorry, not the door frame, the window frame here. Create another render region. Okay, so there's that nasty shadow. Now, the shadow, there's really nothing wrong with it in terms of the physical correctness. The portal light is behaving the way that it should. But me, as the creator of this scene, and as the artist in this case, I don't want that shadow there. I want to get rid of it, or I want to reduce it as much as possible because I don't like it. So what I can do is I can reduce this multiplier here. So let's knock it down by a good amount. Let's reduce it by half. So we'll go down to 200. See what that gives us. Okay, it fixed the problem a little bit, but you can still see the shadow there, which is no good. So I'm going to reduce it by even more. Let's knock it down to 100. Okay, that looks a little bit better, but we can still see the shadow a little bit there. It's a little bit hard to see, but the shadow is in fact still there. So I'm going to reduce the multiplier down to about, say, 50. Okay, so it looks like the shadow is pretty much gone, but by reducing the multiplier here, we knock down the strength of the light by a good amount. So let's go ahead and increase it back to 100, which is going to bring the shadow back. This is going to give me a great opportunity to demonstrate one of the neat features of using the portal light. The portal light has this neat little feature down here under additional options called light cutoff threshold. This is an awesome setting. Basically what this does, it tells the light when to cut off the intensity. So for example, let's say your light is set up in that other room that we have over there, which if I go back to that room where I show you, let me collapse this so you can see. That area over there is the room where we want that portal light to light up. However, we don't need that portal light to light up this area over here and cast that little shadow right there on that window frame. So what can we do to tell the light to light this area up and focus on this area, and when the light gets really far away and it gets dim over here, to just cut it off? Well, that's what this parameter is for. It cuts off any unnecessary light that we don't need. So the way that this number works, this basically tells the light, look, if the light intensity is at this point or below, the light is not important. Just cut it off. So if the light is too dim, which in this case would be a value of 0.005, which is extremely dim, the light's going to get cut off. So what are the benefits of using this light cutoff threshold? There's a very good key benefit to using it correctly. If used correctly, what you can do is you can have Mental Ray not render any unnecessary light from the portal light, which can reduce your render time by cutting out any unnecessary shadow calculations. And we now know that the portal light, with its nice area light shadows, creates some shadows that take a long time to render. So the more of that you can cut out, the more you can reduce your render time, which is a good thing. So it's great that this portal light has this ability to do this. So let's go ahead and use this setting. Let me show you how the setting works. If I go over here and do a render preview from here, let me just move this over here so we can see this a little bit better. Well, it's going to be very difficult to see because the other lights in our scene aren't going to allow us to see what's going on. So I'm very quickly here just going to close that. And what I'm going to do here, let me collapse that. I'm going to go into the Explorer. Here's all the window lights, and right now you can see they're all just called point 1, point 2, whatever and whatever. Let me rename this stuff because organization is key when working in any 3D software package or when working on anything for that matter, anything, even if you're working in Microsoft Word for that matter. Okay, so let me take these lights and let me rename them. I'm going to take all the big lights, so that will be point 1, and point 2. Hit enter to open up the PPG. I'm going to rename these to large window lights and give it a number. So I'll give it 1. That way it numbers them. So you see we have large window lights 1, 2, and 3. Let's take the point 3, 4, and 5 lights and rename those to small window lights and add number 1 to it. So it renames it. So we have 1, 2, and 3. Makes it a lot easier to work. Okay, so the lights that I want to hide is light 1, light 2, and all of the small window lights. I want to leave large window light 3 because that's the one that's over there in that back room, in that room in the back. So I'll hit H to go ahead and hide those selected lights. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do another render preview here. Alright, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this render preview by clicking the little lock icon there. You can see it, there's very dim light here. It's barely visible, but it's there. Okay, what we want to do is cut that light out. So let's go back to the setting that I was talking about before called light cutoff threshold. And let's increase it. It's a very sensitive parameter, so be careful. 0.005 is a very low setting, but it's a very sensitive parameter in general. So I'll put something like 0.02. Okay, and I'm going to create another render preview and leave the original one there so that I have something to compare to. And there we go. If you look very carefully, you'll notice a difference here, and the difference is that this one's a little bit darker, and you can see it here very clearly. It's much darker. A lot of the light's being cut off because the light is so dim that this setting is telling Mental Ray, look, the light, if it's below 0.02, cut it out. Okay, so that's basically what this is doing. If I take the multiplier here and knock it down to 50, do another render preview, you can see now that we get virtually no light, if at all, in this area, which is exactly what I wanted so that I don't have the shadow being cast there by the window frame. Okay, so I'm going to say that I'm happy with that. So the light cutoff threshold, very important setting, very useful if you know how to take advantage of it. So there you go, real world example of how it can come into use and how to use it correctly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say that my direct lighting setup is pretty much complete. We are going to come back to the area lights and we're going to be messing around with the parameters a lot more later on. But in terms of direct lighting, I'd say that our direct lighting setup is good. Right now this looks dark, of course, because I have to come back here, get all of my lights that I hid before, and unhide them. Now if I do render preview, this should look pretty good. Okay, so that's what it's looking like so far. You can see there in the render preview. I'm going to go ahead and cancel the render preview out. I don't want to waste time looking at the whole thing or waiting for it to finish rendering because I already have a good idea of what it's going to look like when it's finished rendering. Okay, very good. Alright, so now that I solved some problems here and I have my initial direct lighting setup pretty much set up, it's time to move on to the next phase of lighting up this scene. So I'm going to end this video here because it's been going on for a pretty long while now. And in the next video we'll pick up exactly where I left off and continue working on lighting up this nice architectural visualization.